It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Shadow Environment Minister Olivia Blake, Conservative MP Faye Jones, Professor of Politics at the University of Kent, Matthew Goodwin, and Chief Features Writer at the Northern Echo, Chris Lloyd. Today,
real heartache for England's young lions.
The agony of defeat, then a torrent of online racist abuse directed at players. Boris Johnson says the abusers should be ashamed of themselves. COVID laws become COVID guidance.
I don't think that that the British people will struggle to look at the guidance and form their own common sense judgments.
Is the minister right? And should we be able to roam over the countryside without it being trespass? Let's have a look at a couple of newspaper headlines following the defeat last night of the England team. There's The Guardian. So close, Gareth Southgate hugging Saka there on the front page. The next paper is Chris, our guest's paper, The Northern Echo. You did us proud. And finally, The Times. There are the players there with the slug Arrivederci. Farewell. Before we get into further discussion about the defeat and some of the abuse, what positives have our guests taken away from the tournament? Olivia, let's start with you.
Well, it's been really interesting to see England do so well, and I've been so excited. And I think that actually it's been really positive because the players on and off the pitch have been such an inspiration to our young people in particular, especially as they're such a young team. So I think it's been a really positive experience for England, and we've got a lot to be proud of from the last couple of weeks.
Faye, the positives for you?
Well, it was great seeing England get so far, but once again, hopes dashed. I think for me, it was about seeing Wales and Scotland and England all competing in the tournament. But at the end of the day, having a home nation in the final is something to be hugely proud about. So all coming together behind one domestic team was brilliant for me.
Chris?
Yeah, it was great seeing a young, diverse and united team as well. And I think almost for the first time I can remember, the Cross of St George was reclaimed, and you could feel really proud of it.
Matthew?
Well, what everybody else said, I completely agree. I do think, Joe, it's a sort of new, interesting moment for Englishness in the country. I think, unlike Euro 96, when we suddenly realised people did feel English, and that was a sort of talking point, now it is, what's the content of that Englishness? What does it mean to be English? And I think that's the legacy I think that's going to stay with us.
All right, well, some of all of what you've said has been marred by the ugliness of racism in tweets last night following the penalty shootout. Let's talk to the CEO of the campaign group Kick It Out, Tony Burnett. Tony, can you give our viewers a sort of sense of the nature and the scale of the abuse without going into specifics or the language used?
It's huge and varied. I was at the game last night. I was lucky enough to be there, and as soon as the Saka unfortunately missed the penalty, myself and colleagues said, let's get ready for a really busy morning, because we knew exactly what was going to come. It comes after every situation that is similar to this, and this is probably obviously the most high profile there's been all season. So we absolutely knew this was going to happen, and it ranges. It's everything from kind of just over racist, horrific abuse to threats of physical violence, and it's always the same patterns. Emojis, various emojis, monkeys are often used in these situations. Nothing that we haven't seen all season and for quite some time, unfortunately.
Right, well, so you were expecting it, which is really rather sad anyway. But let's just show our viewers, and I'll read to our guest, the Priti Patel Home Secretary tweet in response. I'm disgusted that England players who have given so much for our country this summer have been subject to vile racist abuse on social media. It has no place in our country, and I back the police to hold those responsible accountable. Are you satisfied with that, Tony, in terms of response from a high-profile politician?
No, I'm not, actually, and I'm not satisfied with actually the behaviour of our political colleagues on many occasions when it comes to the discussion around this, and particularly discussion around race and racism in football. We had a lot of dialogue about taking the knee and various perspectives espoused, and I just think that also gives license to people like this to behave in the way that they do. I think for me as well, as an England fan and a father, my heart goes out to Saka actually, and I just want to say what a huge amount of courage that young man showed as a 19-year-old to step up in probably the most pressurised environment he's ever going to face and stand and be counted. And the people who are kind of doing this are just showing the opposite. They're cowards. But from a Saka perspective, I think he's proved what a fantastic young man he is. And Gareth Southgate in the team, I think people, colleagues on the programme have already mentioned, but what a credit to our country. Gareth Southgate's been as a leader, and the team have been in terms of representing what is a multicultural country, and very proud to be so.
Right. Well, Faye, do you agree with Tony's assessment that actually the politicians haven't done enough? In fact, they may have even in some way given licence to people to make those sorts of racist comments on social media?
No, I don't agree with that at all. I think the Prime Minister has been vocal in calling it out, as has the Home Secretary. I think, there is a debate to be had around the politicisation of football. And, other colleagues of mine have decided not to get involved. That's their choice. But the Prime Minister has been really clear that everybody does have a right to protest and that this absolutely needs to be tackled. And that's why we're bringing forward legislation on this as soon as possible.
Tony?
I think legislation is massively important. The Online Harms Bill is really important. It's not happening quick enough. I think we've got to put far more pressure on our social media organisations, both in terms of account verification and putting better filtering processes in place to stop this stuff getting to people in the first place. But I don't agree, actually, no, from a political perspective. I think there's been far too much gesture politics involved in this. A group of young men decided, around taking the knee, they were going to take a stand against discrimination. And everybody's got a view on how they should do it. And I don't agree with that at all. We should be celebrating the fact that a group of young men have taken a stand against something that is a scourge of our society and has been for many, many decades, instead of discussing the gesture they choose to use to demonstrate the fact they're anti-discrimination. I think they should be applauded for what they've done.
Right. Well, Faye, what do you say in response? Because we know it's been ministers, not just Tory MPs or backbenchers. We had Gillian Keegan and Priti Patel casting doubt on the issue of taking the knee.
Well, I think it is a little bit inconsistent of the FA to prohibit certain types of political protests, but this one is allowed. But that said, everybody wants to work together to eradicate all forms of racism from our society, but particularly sport. And so I fully agree with what Tony said there around the social media companies. I don't think they're doing anywhere near enough to tackle this issue. They have been willing to act. You saw in the US election last year that they were quite rightly willing and quick to take action against what the president was saying, but they're not quick to deal with racist tweets that are published on their platforms. And I want to see urgent action taken against them.
Right. I mean, do you agree, Tony, with Faye, that this is political?
It's not political in the slightest. I think, again, that is the huge red herring here. It's a group of young men that decided to take a gesture. When Colin Kaepernick did this in 2016, nobody was talking about politics. It was a gesture in solidarity of what he felt was absolutely the right thing, which is to fight discrimination. And this is what our players have done. It's been politicised not by our players, but by everyone else around them. And we've let our players down. Our players can hold their heads up high. Gareth Southgate can hold his head up high. There's a lot of people around this discussion should do some serious self-reflection because you've let our players down. We had a huge moment to bring the country together, and I'm proud and so pleased that Gareth Southgate and the team have managed to do that despite some of the backbiting and sniping that's gone on. Not political. This is about stopping discrimination, and what's happened in the last 24 hours has just given more fuel to the fire, actually, and proved we need to do more. The reason the players take the knee is because of what we've seen in the last 24 hours.
Faye?
Well, again, I'm sorry, I disagree. I think it is a symbol of a political campaign. And I fully support the principle that racism should be eradicated. And I stand by every player and everyone who is trying to do that. But this is a political symbol. I think that's the problem that certain people have had with it.
Right. Well, Tony, you're shaking your head. We've heard from both of you. Olivia, what's your response?
It's just not true. Yeah.
What's your response?
Well, I think I was absolutely devastated to see some of the headlines this morning around the abuse that's been faced by the three players. And I think it's absolutely essential that not only Facebook and Twitter and the other social media platforms get a grip of this, but actually Boris Johnson uses the power that he does have. Rather than having warm words and massive flags, he's been silent on this issue for so long. He has power to really implement change in this space so that no one has to face abuse at the hands of those online and in person, in fact, as well.
Matthew?
Well, I think sometimes what happened this morning and what happened on social media is horrific. I think also it's worth remembering the long-term trends in how we think about being English and what it means to be English. So today, about 10 to 14% of people will say you have to be white to be English. A very minority fringe view. The vast majority of people say, I have absolutely no issue with somebody who isn't white being English. And, in the 1980s and 1990s, that simply wasn't the case. And as a country, we have made remarkable progress. Now, that 10 to 14%, as some of the speakers alluded to, has coincided with social media. So social media has basically amplified that minority voice, which is then a lot louder, or seems to be a lot louder than it actually is.
Olivia?
I just think that's being too slack about this issue. I think, this isn't about Englishness. This is about racism. That is the issue that we're facing. That's what needs challenging, and that's on all of us to do.
I don't think anyone disagrees with that at all. All I'm saying is sometimes when we have these conversations, we forget at the same time the amount of progress that we've made as a country, and that sort of tends to be pushed into the back seat. And it's a good story. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff happening in Britain, and we should talk more about that.
Chris?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. I mentioned earlier on the way we have reclaimed the Cross of St George, which had 30, 40 years ago become a symbol for a real political movement that separated many people from the national football team. But we've managed to reclaim that as a source of pride now. And I think the footballers actually tried to reclaim taking the knee, so that it was just a gesture of equality and fairness. And it's only kind of politicians who have politicised it, so that they're making a direct connection to some of the wilder extremes of the Black Lives Matter campaign. I would also like to point out that as a very old-fashioned dinosaur of a journalist, we have to edit things, and we have to edit even readers' letters cannot go in a wonderful newspaper without someone having cast a critical eye over them and saying, is this libelous, is this racist? And yet the whole social media seems to kind of encourage an explosion of unregulated comments, and it'd be brilliant to see social media companies actually identifying the people who are saying this and holding them up and shining a light on them, and then shutting down those accounts.
Well, I just want to show everybody, but I'd like you, Faye, to respond to Saeeda Varsi, the Tories' former party chairman. She says, she's referring to Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, we as government, as Conservatives, need to think about our role in feeding this culture in our country. If we whistle and the dog reacts, we can't be shocked if it barks and bites. It's time to stop the culture wars that are feeding division. Dog whistles win votes but destroy nations. This is a former Conservative Party chairman, Faye. Is she right?
I don't know. I was listening along, but I don't know the context of that comment. But I think you need to look at what the government is doing. And I think the online harms bill is a really important way of tackling this. I think back to the comments that we were making just now, they're not playing their part. Social media companies are not playing their part, and they need to take the responsibility for these anonymous accounts. And we need to find a way of them regulating themselves. If they won't do it, the government will force them to do it, and will force them to pay a 10% fine of their global revenue. So the government is taking this incredibly seriously.
Right, but is your party engaging in culture wars, as Saeeda Varsi suggests very clearly in that tweet, over the discussion of taking the knee?
I don't believe we are. No, I think there are colleagues who have views. I don't share them.
Right.
But the Prime Minister has been very clear that people have a right to protest. And he says we should be celebrating all of those players who were on the pitch last night, certainly not booing them, certainly not booing anybody else's national anthem. So I think it is down to personal choice. I don't believe there's any culture war being stoked.
Right, well, if you're criticising the booing which happened at certain matches, what do you mean by the right to protest?
Well, as the Prime Minister has said, there are differences of views over taking the knee. There are some colleagues who don't support it, some who do. And everybody has a right to protest. But I think booing is a different issue. That's an immense sign of disrespect. And surely we've lost a sense of fair play if we are booing our opponent's national anthem. That's not what sport and that's not what football's about.
Tony?
I agree with that last point, but I also agree with, booing is unpatriotic, and seeing in the early stages of the tournament, our own team, our own England players being booed, for standing up against discrimination was probably one of the most the least patriotic things I've ever seen. It's kind of, it's just shocked me, actually. I've been following England for 40 years and never ever once booed my players, and that's what I regard them as, the England players. So again, I just want to take my hat off to Gareth Southgate and the team for what they've done, because it's been absolutely fantastic in terms of the way they've stood up to that and brought the country together behind a really great example of leadership and togetherness and multicultural Britain.
Tony Burnett, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to talk about COVID and the announcement expected later today. This is the story in BBC News Online. COVID-19. Prime Minister urges caution as 19th of July unlocking set to go ahead, because we are expecting later on Boris Johnson to confirm that almost all of the remaining coronavirus restrictions in England will be lifted in a week's time. But the Prime Minister has said that the new freedoms come with a warning and that we must all be cautious and take responsibility. So is the government striking the right balance? Olivia?
No, I don't think they are striking the right balance. I think this is a very risky step to take. We've heard today that 2 million COVID cases would be expected under these plans, and I think that that's very risky. And I think, they're not listening and they're not learning the lessons of the last year, where they've taken the wrong decisions at every critical point, in my view.
Right. So are you saying that that you don't support the restrictions being lifted on the 19th of July?
So, obviously it's a positive step that restrictions are able to be lifted, but the precautions that we need to take, so mask wearing, for example, we should still be having that on transport and in enclosed spaces. The ability for people to stay at home when they've got a COVID case, we need to continue with payments to people so they're able to do that. It's about the balance, like you said at the beginning, and they've just got it wrong.
Right, so on mask wearing, is that the only difference, though, between Labour and the government?
No, not at all. Like I say, we are really keen to make sure that people continue to self-isolate if they're poorly. So we need to see payments to those people who need to take time off work. But we also want to see more flexibility for people who've had double vaccinations. But we want to make sure that we're having that balance and making sure that we're working as robustly as we can with the scientists.
Right, OK. I mean, if I get on a crowded train, Faye, without a mask on, then I could unwittingly infect my fellow passengers with coronavirus. So is wearing a mask on a crowded train really about personal responsibility, or is it more about social responsibility?
I think everything comes down to personal responsibility, and the government, I think, is going to make it clear. We haven't seen the statement yet. That's this afternoon. The government is going to make it clear that in those situations, it would still be expected for you to wear a mask, and it's going to be your choice. And I think that's really important. We have all sacrificed so much, and so many people, or we've made such great progress because so many people have really engaged with these rules. But now we are moving through a phase of the virus where we can start to cautiously relax some of the restrictions, and it moves from being a government diktat to being a your own choice. And I think that's entirely right. Chris Whitty has outlined 3 scenarios where he would still wear a mask, and one of them is the scenario you mentioned. So I think it's entirely right that we are moving towards a phase of personal responsibility.
Chris, do you think your readers are ready for this?
Well, I think the government, it's almost where we were back in March last year, when I think people saw the lockdown coming and they began to take their own measures before the government actually intervened. I also think that at Christmas, people could see that the whole idea of that explosive unlocking was wrong, and the government had to backtrack on that. And now I think people can see that the whole concept of Victory Over Virus Day or Freedom Day is not quite right, and we're kind of doing far too much too quickly. And I think people can see the efficacy of face masks. 70% of people would like to have face masks still as a legal requirement for the next month, just to see how things go. And I guess that's the same with social distancing and ventilation of buildings as well. So it feels like the government has kind of really sent out a message about how it's going to be real Freedom Day, but now they're kind of retreating, going back on that, and so the whole thing's becoming rather blurred.
Matthew?
Well, I think it's a huge moment for Boris Johnson's premiership, because up until this point, broadly speaking, he's been on the right side of public opinion. Most people backed the lockdowns and they supported the lockdowns. But if you look at the polling this week, I was looking at some numbers by Ipsos Mori on the way here. Actually, a vast majority of people think we should keep some of the social distancing measures and the masks and so forth. And I'm not talking about small numbers here, Joe. I'm talking about 65, 70%. Yeah. So this is a really
we've got some of them here. We can see some
right.
of the views here. Public support for permanent COVID-19 restrictions. You can see the percentages there, but 40% masks in shops and on public transport.
So these numbers are the permanent numbers. There's another question where they ask, well, how about just extending for another month or so? And that's where you find the 60, 70% saying, yeah, actually, I'm not ready for this ripping the plaster off. I'd like to just take a bit more time and care. And, you know, this is going to be a really interesting moment in the Johnson premiership.
Right. Well, what about being on the wrong side then, Faye? Do you agree with what Matthew has just said and looking at those statistics for permanent COVID-19 restrictions to be kept in place? International travel quarantine, 35% support that permanently. So is Boris Johnson on the wrong side?
No, I don't believe the government is on the wrong side. I believe the way in which we are unlocking and sort of heading out of this virus and learning to live with it is absolutely the right way. I only wish here in Wales we had a similar level of visibility, because we have no idea what the government wants to do for us here in Wales. We've got no awareness whatsoever of what it's going to look like for Welsh businesses. And, you know, I think it's really important that we take this seriously in terms of what this will do for our public health. We need to unlock the country. We need to embrace whatever our new normal is going to look like, because businesses and people have been suffering for so long. So, no, I don't think we're on the wrong side of it at all.
Olivia?
Well, I think he has got this wrong. I think he's got this majorly wrong. And I think, you know, the narrative change from public health crisis to personal responsibility is actually impacting the vaccine programme too. We've seen a slowing of young people taking up the vaccine, and I think it's really on us as politicians to really be clear in our messaging around public health crises. Why are we saying you should wear a mask one day? Oh, Chris Whitty says that you should wear a mask, but Boris Johnson is not going to keep it in. It's so confusing for people. People just want clear, honest public health messaging in a crisis like this.
Faye?
I don't think it is confusing at all. I think I've got more faith in the British public than Olivia does. And one thing I forgot to mention, she talked about support payments that need to stay in place. They're staying in place until September. So if you do have to self-isolate, you will continue to be paid. So I'm not really sure where the opposition is on this.
Olivia?
Well, I think it's really quite clear where we are on this. We think that there should be a much more reasonable approach to this, and we shouldn't be ripping that plaster off. We should be having a more balanced view of this, and not being data-centred, being data-centred, and make sure that we're doing things in as safe as possible way.
But what metrics would you use then, Olivia? Because if you broadly support, and the Labour Party broadly supports the thrust of what the government is doing in lifting those restrictions on the 19th of July, apart from not mandating for mask wearing and perhaps doing more on ventilation, there doesn't seem to be that much that divides you. Well,
we need to see much more effort going into vaccinating younger people, and we also need to see a lot more advice and guidance for people around where they should be wearing masks. And I think it should remain mandatory for a limited period, because we're not clear what the outcome of this will be. They're predicting 2 million more cases. You know, we're seeing so many young people getting long COVID, a really debilitating condition, and people coming into hospital younger and younger with this horrid disease. Now, there is another issue we've discussed quite a bit on the programme, and that is around self-isolation. And as everybody knows, the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, said that the rules would change and be reformed, but not until August the 16th, so that if you've been double vaccinated and you do receive an alert to self-isolate, you can test yourself every day. Faye, you are self-isolating, I believe, just at the moment. How did that happen?
Well, a colleague of mine tested positive, and I was in contact with her. And so, I'm afraid that has to stay. You know, if you are in contact with someone who has coronavirus, you do have to self-isolate for 10 days. And then post the 16th of August, we will hopefully get to a situation where if you've been double vaccinated and you test negative, despite a contact of yours testing positive, you won't have to self-isolate, which I really welcome. And as much as I would love to be in Westminster with you today, I was really hoping I might get my hands on a Politics Live mug after so many years of trying.
Well, we'll hold on to one for you.
Oh, that would be kind, thank you. But, we have to stick with this. These are the hard yards. We do need to spend these next few weeks trying to get more younger people vaccinated. We've already reduced the gap between for first and second doses from 12 weeks down to 8. And so these last few weeks now are trying to get as many people over the line with that second vaccination. So as much as I would love to be with you, self-isolation is going to have to stay until 16.
Chris?
Up in Newcastle, I heard of a restaurant where they don't like their staff to have their mobile phones with them, so they all put them in one safe area whilst everyone's doing the shift, and then all 14 of them were pinged, even though the mobile phones have been tucked away, and so the whole restaurant, therefore, is in trouble. So we haven't managed to yet, even though we've refined all of our other laws over the course of the pandemic, the NHS app is still pinging quite merrily away, and so we haven't yet kind of worked out how it should work with testing, and also we put all of our faith into technology in the belief that technology is going to cure everything, where really a proper human phone-to-phone test and trace would kind of eradicate some of the absurdities like the one I mentioned of that restaurant.
All right, well, let's talk about free speech, because a government bill aimed at protecting free speech on university campuses is being debated today. Matthew, you wrote this in February. This is just the headline of the piece. It's in the Daily Mail. Academics like me live in fear of the woke hate mob. Professor of Politics at the University of Kent writes. Why?
Well, I think that our higher education sector is losing its way. I don't think that it is as open and tolerant of people with different ideological views, whether they are gender critical, whether they are conservative, whether they accept the Brexit vote. We now are in a situation, Joe, where about 85-90% of academics lean to the left, about 1 in 10 lean to the right. And in some cases, that has resulted in what I would describe as harassment, intimidation and bullying of colleagues. And this isn't about cancelling events. So typically people will say, well, no events have been cancelled, therefore we don't have an issue on campus. This is actually about the indirect forms of harassment that leave certain academics feeling as though they're being persecuted because of their ideological views. That's why we need someone outside of universities who they can turn to and say, actually, could you investigate this? I feel like I'm being harassed simply because of what I think around issues like the environment or gender or Brexit and so on.
Olivia?
Well, personally, I think that this is very much a hate speech bill. I think that this is offering protection to people with anti-Semitic views, for example, who would be able to go around our campuses and spread what is essentially hate. And I think that it's really an unnecessary bit of legislation. There's no need for this to come forward. It's completely the wrong priorities. We should be talking about social care and the crisis we've got there. This is more about covering the Tories' failures than actually tackling real issues that matter to people. And I'm sorry for any abuse that Matthew may have had himself, but, everyone in the public eye at the moment is subject to that abuse that we've been talking about earlier. And that, again, goes back to government. They should be doing more about that. They should be doing more about abuse, but they are completely setting up a culture war here, and it's absolutely unnecessary.
Yeah, I mean, I don't find that convincing, really, on any level. I think the view among a significant number of people on Britain's university campuses, and let's not forget, this is one of the reasons Britain is, such a great country. We've got the world's leading universities that are delivering, top vaccines and everything else. This is something we really need to preserve and protect. But when you're seeing young colleagues being sacked, or you're seeing academics being chased off campus by protests and open letters, this is not actually what anybody wants to see in any civilized modern society. And the universities, in my personal view, have failed to provide an environment where people feel that they can express their views and not be persecuted and harassed. And I would have thought that the Labour Party would be ordinarily supporting that kind of environment. And I find it quite disturbing that actually there's a sort of straight line drawn between saying, let's preserve viewpoint diversity on campus, to we're promoting hate speech. I don't understand the relationship between those two.
Well, obviously, I'm very much proud to respect and champion free speech. That isn't what this is about, though. This is very much about stoking a culture war around hate, and this is the big issue that we're facing. We've got a huge challenge in society to protect people from discrimination that we've seen and spoken about this morning, this is just one more step by government to say, no, actually, anti-Semitism is fine, racism is fine.
Nobody's saying anti-Semitism or racism are fine at all. I don't,
to express these issues.
But who's saying that those are fine? I don't know anybody who's saying
why
those are fine.
But why should people be protected for views which are harmful to others?
But we have existing
You
legislation.
don't have a right not to be offended.
Yes, but I have a right not to be discriminated against.
Faye?
There's laws to protect me from discrimination as a disabled woman, isn't there?
Exactly, and those laws and others similar exist already.
But this undermines that.
And that's why this bill is not affecting that. You've got to be really clear. This separates unlawful hate speech from lawful things which might cause offence to you because you don't agree with them, or someone else because they don't agree. This is
it's blurring the line. It's blurring the line on discrimination, absolutely. And that's why it's so dangerous and so un-British. It's the worst bit of legislation that the government could be bringing forward. Why aren't we discussing the online harms bill today? Why has that been pushed back again? Pushed back again. Why are we not discussing social care, adult social care, and what it means for people in this country to actually live well? Why are we discussing this toxic issue in a way that is supporting and protecting people from their own...
It's really not. It's really not toxic.
It absolutely is.
I have done Zooms with students and young people in my constituency, and I get an email afterwards from a young person who says, thanks for saying that, because I really didn't feel that I was able to put my Conservative or pro-Brexit or whatever their viewpoint might be, they didn't feel able to do that. Now, this bill this covers higher education, of course, but this is going to create a safer space for everybody. And I think it's really important that we stand up for our universities. They are world-class assets that we should be rightly proud of, but they mustn't become these places where people are afraid to speak their mind. And this bill will stop that.
It doesn't feel safer to me as a disabled woman at all that these issues are being kind of hampered by this bit of legislation. I think, there's a freedom to express yourself and there's a freedom to express disgust at that as well. But there's also a freedom from discrimination that we should be fighting for and protecting people from. And that's where the line's getting blurred. There's no need for this legislation. If it was about events, which a lot of people think it is, only 6 were cancelled, and that was because of poorly managed paperwork. This is a false issue. It's not mainstream. It's not the main concern of the British people and my constituents.
Faye?
And the government should drop it.
Well, I completely disagree, because it is clear that not all voices are being heard at the moment. And I think it's really important that we get a grip on this. I went to university where my ideas were challenged, and I went in thinking certain things and I came out thinking other ones. And I hope I am a more well-rounded person as a result of that experience. You don't learn anything if you deny people the right to say what they think. So I think this bill is extremely important, and it's clear that people do want it, despite what Olivia thinks, because it was a key part of our manifesto, which we were voted in on in 2019.
Chris, where are you on this issue? Is it necessary, this legislation?
I'm worried about the effects the legislation is going to have in that it creates a big space for freedom of speech, but then does that allow another minority of extremism that wouldn't have needed to be vented to come forward? So by a small minority shouting down someone like Amber Rudd has enabled given space for another small minority shouting out about Holocaust denials to be guaranteed a free space. I also think it's really interesting also that when the government is kind of turning to personal responsibility for the way we're fighting COVID. It says that you should wear a mask in circumstances of common courtesy. I'm sure this sounds rather trite, but common courtesy, of course, would mean that none of this issue, there'll be no shouting down on either side. So we're kind of legislating to stop common courtesy being employed in this case, whereas we're kind of ensuring common courtesy is the way the pandemic is going to be tackled on the other side.
Right. I mean, Matthew, do you see and sympathise with what Olivia and to some extent Chris are saying, that there is a danger of overcorrecting here? You will fuel a culture war, as Olivia says.
I don't find this argument that it's a conservative culture war at all convincing. We have, the King's research recently showed, we have about 25% of students self-censoring, feeling that they cannot express their views in class. If there is a culture war, if there is an attempt to control speech, it's certainly not coming from that direction. And I think more broadly, if somebody breaches existing legislation, existing laws that we have on racial and religious hatred, we have legislation for that. What we don't have, Joe, at the moment is anything that can be we don't have an outlet for people who are being persecuted within universities, let's say because they have an unorthodox view on gender, or they have an unorthodox view on Brexit, or perhaps some students have complained and they've been summarily suspended and dismissed from university. Those academics need protection, and that ultimately is what the bill is designed to do.
Are you convinced, Olivia, by people who have unorthodox views, to use the word that Matthew cites?
I think unorthodox can quite often be a very polite way of saying very, very highly offensive and harmful language.
But there we are.
And
that's exactly what this is about.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, the
and
Labour
breaking
Party...
the discrimination line. And that's what it has to be about, protecting people from discrimination.
No. Universities are about the pursuit of truth. That's why we are here. We are here to pursue the truth by interrogating things that might make people uncomfortable. We cannot impose dogma on universities.
And that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that there's a line and people are crossing it. And when they cross it, they should deal with the consequences.
We'll leave it there because we're going to talk about trespassing and whether people should have the right to roam beyond public footpaths. Let's talk to Nick Hayes. Welcome him to Politics Live, author of The Book of Trespass. Hello to you. What do you argue for in the book, Nick?
Hey, thanks for having me on. I simply argue for the public's right to have more access to nature that gives them so much in the way of mental, physical and spiritual health. I also chuck in a bit of history as to why and how we got excluded from the countryside that we once had rights to, not 200 years ago, basically.
Right. I mean, it's one thing, I suppose, talking about a right to roam in places owned by big landowners, for example. But presumably, scrapping trespass laws would extend to regular homeowners too, and not many people want people trampling over their gardens.
Well, I'm not sure why you have made that assumption, really. There's every single right to roam legislation across Europe, from Scotland, our next door neighbours, to Norway, Sweden, Latvia, Estonia. None of them are encouraging home invasion. There's nothing in the law that suggests it's acceptable to invade someone's private property. In fact, the core of every single one of those legislations is the protection of private property. The issue we have in England is just simply one of scale. If the law treats home invasion into someone's back garden, as it does in England, as the same as taking a stroll in 12,000 acres of deciduous woodland, then of course people might be worried that the right to roam would include their back gardens, but it is safeguarded in every single legislation. And so it should be. People have a right to privacy, but also the general public have a right to access nature.
Right. Well, Chris, do you welcome Nick's ideas?
Well, I'm 95% convinced. And the book is beautifully written, poetically written. And I'm not just saying that because early on he praises the unacknowledged heroes of England, the local amateur historians who write pamphlets about strange local areas that you can pick up in a quid in the junk shop, because I am one of those pamphleteers, I'm afraid. And I think, though, there is a real point about the new relationship that we're gathering to the countryside. The pandemic staycations have proven that the countryside brings many, many benefits, and economically as well. Here in the Yorkshire Dales, they're full of people staycating and going out and wanting to walk in the countryside. And I think Brexit can also change the way we pay for the way the landowners are custodians of our countryside. And I do agree that every major riverbank should have public access to it, ideally with an ice cream refuge and a cake shop every quarter of a mile.
I can see where you're going with this, Chris. You're getting lots of support, no doubt. Supportive nods. Faye, you're obviously loving that part of it, but what about expanding right to roam? Because at the moment, trespassing is a civil offence. The Conservative manifesto promised to make it criminal. Is that the right way to go?
Well, I think it's really important that we do something about this, and I think we've also got to be clear about what we're talking about. I live in a very rural area, and if we had tens of thousands of people, unlimited right to roam, I'd be quite worried about their safety, because this is grazed livestock area, and we need to be really careful that we make sure that gates are closed, that livestock are looked after. So before we go in for a full right to roam, I think we need to look at really acquainting people with the Countryside Code and making sure that they know what it's like to live here and the damage that inadvertent things like that could cause. So that's what I think I would be looking at first, because it is stunning, it's beautiful, and I do want one of the most important legacies of COVID to be a greater connection with our outdoor spaces. I do want that to survive, but we need to make sure that we do it safely.
Nick?
Well, I'm glad everyone's in agreement. It's obviously the pandemic has brought to the fore how desperately we need a connection with nature. But why not have our rights with our responsibilities? Why not learn our responsibilities to nature through activating our rights? That's the premise of the Finnish right to roam, the Norwegian right to roam. All of these things, the Scottish Outdoor Access Code in 2003 was launched with the Land Reform Act that opened up land, water, not just to rambling, which is fundamentally all we're allowed to do, but to paddleboarding, kayaking, both of which over lockdown have seen an explosion in membership and sales. Wild swimming. All of these legislations come with responsibilities, strictly coded responsibilities, not just to the ecology of the landscape, but also to the people that work and live within it as well. And why not just why not receive the rights through activating your responsibilities? It's not actually a new idea. It's the old form of commoning as it was before private property really dominated our nation. You don't get your right to the countryside without actively caring for it. And there's a myriad of ways in which the government could look into promoting that to people as well.
All right. Well, Olivia, what do you think of what you've heard? Expanding right to roam.
Oh, you know, this is a topic very close to my heart, representing part of the Peak District in my constituency and the great history we have there. And I think that, you know, this is a really, really important point for people to reconnect with nature, be able to access nature is so important. And as Shadow Minister for Nature, I think that is absolutely vital. But I do just want to touch on the persecution of the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller community and what this the Police and Crime Sentencing Bill seeks to do, which is essentially criminalise a way of life. And I think that we've seen some horrible comments actually made on the floor of the House of Commons, and Labour have been really fighting Section 4 of that bill in particular, because of that.
Faye?
Well, I think what the government has been doing is actually working with local authorities to try and increase the availability of authorised traveller sites. I think something like 11.5 billion has gone into housing in England. And bear in mind, I'm sorry, I'm not as familiar with this as I should be, as of course this is devolved to the Welsh Labour government here in Wales. But we are working with local authorities to ensure that we can increase the availability of traveller sites. So I don't accept Olivia's characterisation of the bill as persecution whatsoever.
All right, we're going to say goodbye to Nick from his houseboat. Thank you very much for joining us. What do you like to roam? Matthew?
I do, very much. And what's interesting, Joe, is if you, not to take this back to Brexit, but if you look at Remainers and Leavers, the one thing I would say is they have very different visions of what it means to be British, but there are two things that unite them. One is the NHS, and the other is the countryside, the green and pleasant land. And it's that point of unity that I think we've been struggling to find.
Chris, you were nodding away. Do you agree?
Oh, yes, I do. I think everyone comes together. I would just like to say that last night I went out on a bike ride out into the countryside.
Quickly.
And me and my son aimed for Legs Cross, but the pathway was completely blocked. And I would like to be able to roam where I already have the right to before I get the right to roam everywhere else.
All right, well, before I let you go and roam wherever you want to, it's goodbye from us. Bye-bye.